All right, well, here we go. Buckle your seatbelts for the 19th century. This was one wild century in America, vitally important to religion as we know it today. 5 major headings, the beginning of the Western mission throughout the United States in the early 19th century, but going right into the Second Great Awakening. Arguably not nearly so great as the First Great Awakening, and that for a lot of reasons. As we're going to see, this is kind of the beginnings of Christianity and show business, and Christianity being a series of competing shows, as we'll see. We'll talk about the old school, new school division of the Presbyterians and where they fell down on a variety of issues, and then we'll jump into the topic of slavery, and finally look at how things panned out after the war in the 19th century. So let's jump right in. Here's kind of a timeline. I always like to throw one of these out at the beginning early 1800s. We saw last time we met when Princeton Seminary, a Presbyterian institution, was established in 1812. We got an introduction to Charles Hodge, but he's surely going to be one of the biggest theological voices of the century, spanning, the greater part of it by far. We'll also talk about really important Southern Presbyterian theologians like R.L. Dabney, Thornwell, and we'll talk about, the various cults that arose. Many of you might not know this, but there were a lot of Americans, a tremendous number of Americans who were very sure Jesus was going to return in 1844. We'll talk about the Adventist movement, and it was published throughout newspapers across the country as the Great Disappointment. And so we'll take a look at this time, and of course there's a major split in the Presbyterian Church from 1837 to 1869, extending through the Civil War, where you have 2 entirely competing branches of the Presbyterian Church, the old and the new school. And you guys remember last time we talked about the old side and the new side. A lot of overlap in the issues that divided the Presbyterian Church, but they become more focused here, we'll see. And they obviously entail matters pertaining to abolition. So let's take a peek. So going westward, this is at the forefront of not only settlers' minds, but missionaries' minds. And you look at this, for example, Western Pennsylvania saw dramatic growth in the early 1800s. You look at this, in 1800, you had 82 Presbyterian ministers and 180 congregations, and within 20 years, basically you double both of those. And this is just in the state of Pennsylvania as you're going westward. And at this time, Ohio and Kentucky, well, that was the West in those days. In the early 1800s, we'll see just an explosion of churches out there. As people are encouraged to go that direction. You can settle in places for free in many instances, and you can find yourself with the ability to start a whole new life. And one of the impetuses for people coming to America from the very beginning was that you could have some sort of economic mobility that you simply could not have in continental Europe or in England. So if you look at this, this is a solid map of roughly the time period, but this is the West, as a little circle here. And the sorts of paths that people would take, you would often immigrate and find yourself in New York, obviously a major point, but also Philadelphia. And anybody remember the center of American Presbyterianism? Where would that be? Last lecture? It's Philadelphia. It's the Middle Colonies. Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland. First Presbyterian Church, as we saw, Macamee being the founder of all of these churches in Delaware, well, beginning Maryland, and then in that particular region, New Jersey. So that's the direction that people are headed. Of course, there was also, those who immigrated to the South to begin with, but especially the Middle Colonies was seeing tremendous immigration in this period. Now, here is what happens with the Presbyterians at this time. You might recall that the original settlers in Massachusetts, the girth of them are going to be congregational. Those are people who agree with the Westminster Standards. And notably, the Westminster Standards don't state their ecclesiology in any depth inside of, say, the Westminster Confession, larger catechism, or shorter catechism. How the church was going to be organized, Congregationalists, they don't have a presbytery like we do. Most of the decisions would be made on a very local level and would be made with congregational input to a degree that you wouldn't find in churches with a presbytery. So here's what people started thinking in the early 1800s. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, we pretty much agree on the biggest things. We're Reformed, we're Calvinistic, we agree, we're using the Westminster Larger Shorter Catechism in our instruction in the church. And the thought was, why don't we work together? We have this vast westward mission. Why don't we join hands in this effort and this endeavor? And you have a formal plan of union in 1801. And the place where this really takes off is actually Union College in New York. And Union College was actually named after a joint endeavor of Dutch Reformed and Presbyterians. And what a place to begin thinking about how we can be a unified missionary entity at the time. And so you have one individual, John Smith, another individual, Eliphalet Knott, and these two represent both Presbyterian and Congregationalists, and the plan is to get together, and they draw up the plan. I'll point it out to you. This is Knott Memorial, which is actually built in the 19th century, and it resides at Union College in New York, not to be confused with the Union College in the South. But with that said, here are the 4 points. Here's the plan. Number one, when we send out missionaries, whether congregational or Presbyterian, if they're in neighboring cities, we want mutual forbearance. We want them to take up the needs of one another. And there are all sorts of needs. I'll fill your pulpit. You can fill mine. There could be all sorts of tangible needs. If someone's property was destroyed, we'll raise, various means of support for one another. So working together. But this is where it gets complicated. Say you're a congregational church and you get sent out with a Presbyterian ordained minister. And then you got issues with the pastor. Well, the plan says that that pastor, since he's Presbyterian, despite the fact that you're a congregational church, he will be taken to a Presbyterian court because he is Presbyterian ordained. Well, what if you are a Presbyterian congregation that got sent out with a Congregationalist minister? Well, because he's ordained with a Congregationalist, you're going to go about a congregational means of discipline for this man. And you can see how this would get a little bit uncomfortable very quickly. And yet, you could say in the idealistic, optimistic thinking of the 19th century, they're like, this is going to be great. Well, it gets really complex when you have a congregation, the majority of which is just barely more congregational than Presbyterian. And they had a complex explanation for how you're going to deal with that. But you can imagine how this sort of a scenario is going to make one side of the equation feel like they're getting the lesser hand in various instances. And this is going to be at the heart of some of the disputes between the old school and the new school. I'll let you guess who was for this plan, and I'll let you guess who wasn't for this plan. Who do you think liked this? Old school or new school Presbyterians? New school. The old school, they want Presbyterian government wherever they go. They're not interested in this new point of union, and it's really frustrating to them, and you'll begin to see why they're bothered by it. In general, the Congregationalists were slightly more liberal in their views of how you could articulate, say, Calvinism, how you could articulate how Adam's sin gets counted to us and imputed to us. They were engaging new ideas, and in fact, Unitarianism is overrunning all of the congregational seminaries, Harvard, Yale. So the older school Presbyterians aren't too excited about this. But they're also sometimes very ambitious. And we'll see in the course of this that the new school is going to grow rapidly, and they're going to grow rapidly in the West. So here's what it's called. It's called the Missionary Association of Congregational Churches and the Synod of New York. So this is a congregational thing. And the Synod of New York, they're going to work together for this Western mission. For them, it's largely Ohio, regions even west of that. And they utilize what you'd call a parachurch entity called they utilize home missions and home missionary societies. That's to say, this organization is not run by the Presbyterian Church. It's run by some body mixed with Presbyterians and Congregationalists. Now today, how many people know what a parachurch ministry is? Yeah, you think of all sorts of them. Young Life, Campus Crusade for Christ, all sorts of, they're ministries where people are to be reached with the gospel, but they're not tied down to any church, right? Well, the 19th century is going to see the birthing of all sorts of parachurch ministries. And the question, for example, everybody, how many people have heard about Ravi Zacharias and the scandals surrounding Ravi? Okay. So can anyone tell me what church Ravi Zacharias belonged to? The fact is, no one can tell you what church Ravi Zacharias belonged to. So when these improprieties, say he had been found, whose task would it be to discipline Ravi? It would be none but the public's to cancel him, I guess. I mean, would be your option. You'd take to Twitter, which people are doing after he's dead. But my point is, this is an uncomfortable place to be if you're a church serious about your doctrine and serious about what you believe. And yet, American pragmatism is already being birthed. Does it work? It's a big American question. The question for the window of time within which you decide whether something worked is an important one. It seemed to work on the front end. We'll look at how things pan out in the course of time. Now, for Presbyterians, anybody remember one of the major distinctions between Presbyterians and Baptists with regard to pastors? Yeah. Presbyterians are not going to ordain a man who's not been formally educated. Well, what does that mean in America if you're pressing westward to go and plant churches? Yeah, we got Princeton at this point, which is kind of the crown jewel of Presbyterian schools. But that's not going to serve you so well if you're in all of these different corners of the country. Well, 7 new Presbyterian seminaries get founded between 1812 and 1836. That's pretty ambitious. And these are enduring seminaries, many of them. You've got Union, Virginia, and you've got... which is funny because there's also Union, New York, which is kind of confusing. How many people know that Union, New York has recently more or less just completely closed? Had like a really weird, it's just evolved into a strange religion department that it's inconceivable why anyone would ever want to go there because they don't really have any theological grounding anymore. But they also began founding seminaries out in the West, in Ohio, in Pittsburgh is still around, Danville, Kentucky, and of course Auburn up there in upstate New York. So they're getting to be a more serious institution in the United States, and they're not a one-shot sort of a denomination where they've got Princeton and that's it. Of course, the Congregationalists, they have Yale and Harvard. Of course, Brown was founded in Rhode Island, which, was the first, Baptistic sort of context. But let's see what happens here. It's in this time frame, remember, you have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The mandate to go even further west is now manifesting itself. War of 1812 really ties up things with England, and they're not going to be a problem out west anymore after that. Spanish-American War pressing even further into the 19th century renders it so that it's clear that even further west there is more to be colonized. And of course, this is where you get the concept of manifest destiny. I don't know if there's the symbolic angel of many Americans leading them onward. I think for the Mormons, that's Moroni. But the picture is there's this manifest destiny to go westward, and Presbyterians are no exception in their felt need to do so. Well, this takes us to the Second Great Awakening, and it really has got to center around this man, Charles Grandeston Finney. Remarkable, remarkable story. So Finney begins as a Baptist. He is born in Connecticut, but his family moves throughout New York, and they keep moving further and further until they get right next to the St. Lawrence River. And in his early life, his family attends a Baptist church, but he hasn't converted. Remember, there's a growing sense of what conversion is, having to be a much more dramatic thing in the course of your life than simply having been baptized and maybe even giving lip service to it. Increasingly, there's this sense that you have to have a rather deep experiential religious moment. And So he actually goes on to study law, and he begins to practice law before his conversion when he's 29 years old. And you'll note that his conversion has 4 years there. Conversion experiences, as we saw when we talked about Edwards, generally wouldn't be a momentary thing necessarily. It'd be more like what you read about in Pilgrim's Progress. There's this walking of a course with the Lord, and there'd be dramatic moments throughout, perhaps. But he starts attending a church in 1817. It's a Presbyterian church. And he's attending it. He's actually like leading music in it. He's doing song and all of these things, but he still doesn't count himself converted until in 1821, he goes on a walk through the woods. There's a lot of walks through the woods you'll find where some wild moments in this period. Walk through the woods in upstate New York, where he has this moment of incredible relief of burden, this sense of God and this sense of redemption. And immediately he comes under the wing of Reverend George Gale. Now, George Gale takes it upon himself, I don't know, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, and decides he's going to be kind of his sole educational outlet. Now, this is not standard Presbyterianism. Standard Presbyterianism is you go to seminary, right? We've talked about this. But he has a very Baptistic moment with Reverend Gale. And Gale takes it upon himself, and rather quickly, he trains him, and rather quickly kind of thrusts him forth to be licensed by their presbytery. Now, upstate New York is considered the West. It's still kind of the wild regions if you're not right on the coast. So you got to do what you got to do, they would argue. And especially the new school is going to argue that. That goes all the way back to the new side. The amount of religious training, how much do you really need to know about church history to be a pastor? How much do you read the original languages? How important is it that you're actually looking at the original Greek? These are the sorts of questions that they're going to ask. It wouldn't appear that Finney was particularly learned about any of these things, but it will appear very quickly that he can draw a crowd. And so the picture is, he begins in his family. He was born in Warren, Connecticut, end up in Henderson, right there, here, right on Lake Ontario, just south of the St. Lawrence. And he ends up in Adams. That's where he has his brief law career and where he starts going to church. Well, he gets licensed to preach. Now, in a Presbyterian polity, the steps you'd take is that you'd come under care and you'd go to presbytery. I meant to say you'd go to seminary. Then, somewhere in there, maybe after graduation, you might pursue licensure to preach so that you can preach at a variety of different churches. You could do pulpit supply. And then in the course of time, maybe you could get ordained to become a pastor there, okay? Well, so he gets licensed in 1823. Now, that's just a couple years after his conversion experience, right? You think of the passage in 1 Timothy, not be quick to ordain. He's not ordained yet, but his first evangelistic work is with a women's missionary society. Now, it's in this time frame that you are increasingly going to have specific ministries directed to, say, well, in this instance, women. But you think today at a normal church, you have what? You got, your young marrieds, you got your singles, you got all these different groups that you're kind of focusing on. Well, that's definitely not a normal thing in the history of the church. This is something that is increasingly being prevalent in the 19th century. And so what they would do is, the argument of the women's societies would often be that women were kind of the backbone of the culture, and they needed ministries directed straight to them. If the wives and the moms have a faith, then they can nurture their children to have a faith, and he becomes involved in a women's missionary society where he would provide those sorts of resources, and he would be something of an itinerant, and particularly around Lake Oneida in New York. But what happens is, after he settles, just briefly, he goes and visits Gale. Remember, the minister who's taken a new call down in western New York. It's an actual name of a city. And there, Finney preaches in the stead of his old mentor. And there begin to be revivals. Now, remember how we've described the various happenings in revivals. They would be marked by a variety of new measures, new things that normally wouldn't be done in the context of church historically. We'll talk about what they are. But there would be dramatic emotional responses. Remember that America has seen this before with George Whitefield, the most famous man in the world who preached to more people alive than any human being ever to live, including Billy Graham, which is remarkable. So they already had a taste for what revivals should look like and should be like. And Finney comes to the scene, and he's the next big thing. In the course of his life, he's going to eventually end up in New York City at Chatham Street Chapel, which this is a picture of it from the 1900s, but it's not that far from what it would have looked like in the lifetime of Finney. And just to give you a sense of what's going on, this is generally called the Second Great Awakening, this time period. In 1831 alone, it is argued that 100,000 people in the state of New York began attending church who previously had not. That's why it's called a rather great awakening. If you were to look, though, at Finney's life, here's what it looks like. I've got some dates on the map. He begins in Adams, does the Female Missionary Society in Oneida, returns to where he settled briefly in Luray, but he goes down to Western, begins preaching in Gales Church, and you have mass revival. In the local surrounding cities, he ends up there too. He's preaching not just on Sundays, he's preaching throughout the week, sometimes multiple days in a row, sometimes for a long, long time, hours and hours, the sorts of things that you associate with revivals. Then he ends up out in eastern New York, right on the border with Massachusetts, from which he then heads down to New York, Philadelphia, and then his biggest season of revival is in Rochester. It's a 6-month straight revival where almost every single night there is some sort of revivalistic activity going on. And it's just, he's hitting it hard, and his health actually really suffers for it. He goes back and forth between Auburn and Buffalo, and shoots out to Boston. Word about this guy is everywhere, all over the place, before he finally takes a call in New York in 1832. And actually, he gets really, really sick. Cholera, I think, I think that's what he gets. And he's like taken out for about a year. Just look at that sort of movement. Daily and nightly preaching. You guys remember, for example, with George Whitefield, he just was nonstop preaching. He made 13 trips to the United States at a time where a trip to the United States on a boat sailing the seas was a very different thing than it was for us. Well, Finney, he is set on a course to be the next George Whitefield. That's his activities would suggest he's trying to do and be. Well, what did these revivals entail? New measures. What are the ordinary means of grace, according to a Presbyterian theology? What's the ordinary way that God's grace is going to get to you, and you are going to be sanctified, assured of salvation, equipped for good works? Anybody? Ordinary means of grace. There are 4 of them. Word, sacrament, of which there are 2, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and prayer. Yes. Yeah, so it's so at the end of the day, those 4 things are at the heart of what we think the New Testament tells us the Lord is going to operate on his people with. Well, the feeling at the time is that there are other means, there are new means, and we'll talk about them. First of all, the things that really bothered the old school are very much like the old side. Number 1, uninvited preaching and using parachurch entities to do it. You walk into town. Who are you? I'm the preacher. What preacher? I'm the preacher who's going to preach right here on the street side in this tent, and I am the preacher to anyone who will show up. I'm anyone's minister. That idea really frustrated the various actual church entities in any city that he would find himself in. And, of course, missionary societies, you name it. What are these things? Who sent you out? The other thing is that there is the concept of immediate conversion. The idea that if you are experiencing some sort of work of God in that moment, at that moment, you can become a member of this church. Right there. And this really persists, especially into charismatic and Pentecostal denominations. How many of you know that the Assemblies of God, for example, they reserve the right to ordain a man to the ministry on the spot? You're a pastor. donned a pastor. That sort of thing is increasingly going to be prominent through the various awakenings. Okay, protracted church meetings. That is to say, something that maybe goes on for 6 hours, maybe longer. And the thought is that this really loans itself at some point to emotional abuses. The idea being that people are in an altered state of mind, not by the ordinary means of grace or by the mighty work of the Holy Spirit, but because, well, frankly, in any religious tradition, you can work someone into a frenzy when they're not being nourished, when they're not sleeping, you name it. One of the most prominent things, and we see this today in our modern day altar calls, is the anxious bench, but it was much more complex at the time. The idea would be there would be a bench that people who maybe had been attending the revival for a while, they would come up and stand in the very center of the service. At the very front, everybody would see them. And the idea would be that they would experience the preaching and the message unlike everyone else. Everybody would be looking at them. And now the focus of the service is not primarily on the word. It's not primarily on the sacrament. It's not even primarily on prayer. It's like, what wild effects are going to happen to these two people? That is now the center of the service. And people would react in wild ways sometimes. And maybe you'd see someone who you'd known for a long time and he'd be at the anxious bench, wailing and crying and responding in wild ways. And at the end of the day, that was very attractive stuff. These new measures, they were effective. Arguably, American pragmatism was preceded by at least several decades by what happens in the church. Don't ever let someone tell you that the church is fundamentally following the culture. I think you could argue in a variety of turns in American church history and church history in general that what the church is doing anticipates what's going to happen in a culture. What do we see that George Marsden argued about Edwards and Whitefield? The first American Revolution was not the American Revolution, but the First Great Awakening. The democratization of religion preceded the creation of a democratic state. Well, other things that would happen, female preaching. Obviously, that would not be a standard thing in the history of the church. You'd have female preachers, and then it would often be married to some of the biggest social issues of the time. This started to come to the forefront of what you would find being preached. Temperance. That is, you will see the temperance movement really take off. You're not to drink alcohol. Abolition of slavery at the time. Suffrage, the female right to vote. These things are getting enmeshed with the preaching. And they're actually sometimes at the forefront. So not only are these new measures, but here's one of the biggest differences between the Second Great Awakening and the First Great Awakening. George Whitefield, what was he Arminian or was he Calvinist? Yeah, if you ever wanted to kick the old, caricature of Calvinists not being evangelistic, the man who preached to more human beings ever than anyone else was a Calvinist. Well, the theology of Charles Grandeston Finney was highly problematic. One of the main things that this is actually something that is agreed upon by all of the major branches of Christianity. Not just even Protestants, but the concept of original sin, and the concept specifically that Adam's sin was sufficient to render all of us guilty before God. We fell in Adam. Romans 5. Charles Grandeston Finney did not agree with that idea. He was explicitly against it. He denied that Adam's sin is counted to us such that we were justifiably hellbound on account of it alone. He would outrightly preach, you're only going to hell for your own sins. And it had married to it, as you're going to see, a radical notion of human freedom, which lies at the heart of the American psyche today, and especially the American evangelical Christian thinking. The other thing is the atonement. The atonement did not effectively redeem anyone. The atonement rendered people salvable. This is a radically different idea than what you're even going to found taught, at the beginning of the Reformation on the lips of Martin Luther. Not only that, but atonement is not even substitutionary. That is to say, it's not that you have a death that you deserve to die, and Jesus died it in your place. And it's not that he did that on behalf of all believers. This is when a toned-down theory of the atonement is really taking off in the more rationalistic regions in America, that the atonement was just a demonstration that God is not pleased with sin. And Jesus identified with humanity, but there's no sense in which he bore the eternal wrath of God in our stead. It is just an indication, and it really breaks down to fundamentally a moral influence theory of the atonement. Jesus walked among us, and yes, he suffered, and God wasn't pleased with human sin, but there's no sense in which he poured out upon his son his own disdain and his own wrath for sin. This just isn't going to work. But Finney had a radical naturalism, which is surprising. Finney believed there was nothing supernatural at its root when it comes to producing a revival. His argument was that if you have the right ingredients, you got the right stuff, it sounds like marketing. If you've marketed this right, you can get a revival every time. It lies right at the beginning of his work, Lectures on Revivals. Somebody want to read this? Scott is our usual reader, but would anyone other than Scott like to read this? Yes.
A revival is not a miracle or dependent on a miracle in any sense. It is purely philosophic result of the right use of the constituted means.
By philosophic, he means scientific. That is to say, with the right ingredients, you can produce a revival every single time. Well, you might not be surprised at this, but Finney shortly parted ways with the Presbyterians. Shortly parted ways. In fact, when Finney got ordained, this is a true story, this is what happened. When Finney got ordained by his local presbytery, this is an epic fail for a presbytery, by the way. And he was asked how well he knew the Westminster Standards. Now, you should be asking all sorts of questions about the Westminster Standards. I'm on our credentials committee. He said he had never really read through them with any thoroughness. The doctrinal standards of the Presbyterian Church had never been read with any degree of thoroughness by this Presbyterian ordained preacher. This is what was happening in the Wild West. You might feel a little bit of sympathy for the old school when you hear stuff like this. Well, eventually, Finney parts ways with the Presbyterians, and listen to this wonderful statement after he parts ways. No doubt there is a jubilee in hell every year about the time of the meeting of the General Assembly. That's of the Presbyterian Church. That's what he thought about the denomination that licensed him and then ordained him. Unbelievable. He ends up joining the Congregationalists, which I already told you were a little bit more left-leaning. They didn't have a Presbyterian. They also didn't have a General Assembly in that same sense. They were more autonomous bodies, the Congregational churches were. And he ends up at Oberlin College, which does have actually a famous history for being abolitionist. It's in Ohio. And that's where he spends out his career. But that is a picture of one of the biggest light, as you might call, if you want to call it that, of the Second Great Awakening. And what they called this region, Finney actually coined this phrase, but it ended up getting used against him. Finney said when he was preaching in central New York that there had already been so many revivals there before him. He kind of, brushed the dust off his feet, and he said, there had been so many revivalists before me. This area is like a burned over field where a fire had taken place. That's a revivalistic fire, but it left everything dead. Well, arguably, Finney became that fire, and this region of New York, from the center out to the west, it was called the burned over district. First by him, but then secondly because of him. And that area, although it saw an explosion, one of Edwards' concerns we saw when we talked about the First Great Awakening is that there wasn't much staying power. Well, I'll just mention a couple of other things about this time. The Presbyterians in a variety of areas had different aberrations. In Kentucky, primarily in the Cumberland region, people would come in Philadelphia, they'd go on the Great Valley Road, they'd go down through the Wilderness Road, and they end up in southeast Kentucky. James McGready, another revivalistic preacher. Well, at the end of the day, they really take issue with predestination, which is a part of the Calvinistic system, and they split. They end up splitting from the greater Presbyterian church, and to this day, there is a Cumberland Presbyterian church, trace their roots back to this time. But they actually modified the confession. So look at what they did. They wanted to change the shorter catechism. The original says, the decrees of God are his eternal purpose according to the counsel of his will, whereby for his own glory he hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. Remember, for Calvinists, this does not conflict with the idea that our choices are our own, that in some mysterious sense, we birth these choices as free, but God's sovereignty and his foreordination encompasses everything from beginning to end. He's not surprised by the future. Well, they change it, and they say the decrees of God are his purpose according to the counsel of his own will, and I'm not sure the significance of own, but it says, whereby he hath foreordained to bring to pass what shall be for his glory. Now, the implication there is God is just bringing to pass what already would have come to pass. It's as if there's this future that shall be without his prior will and ordination. And then it says specifically, though, not sin. For sin not being for God's glory, therefore he hath not decreed it. Is that what Ephesians 1:11 says? God is working out all things except for sin for his glory? Or does it say that he's working out all things for his glory? So that even the worst of circumstances in human history, like, I don't know, maybe selling the Savior for 30 pieces of silver, even horrible things like that, are being worked out for God's glory. Well, the Cumberlands part ways with this. You can start to see where there's going to be this old school. He's a little bit frustrated. I'll just tell you one more. The Cane Ridge revivals, with Barton Stone being at the epicenter of this. The Cane Ridge revivals, when you read about people's observations of it, they're frightening, actually. People were very scared of what was going on here. This is, you can't see the picture so well, but out in the woods, they met by this old wood building that you can go and visit today. There's Barton Stone with the masses around him. But basically, this Cane Ridge revival began during communion season. Now, this is actually a classic American tradition that you tend to do communion maybe 4 times a year. We do it weekly, like Calvin always wanted to, but the city council didn't, and he could only get it quarterly. But he would make sure that one church in Geneva every Sunday was doing it. Well, they did it seasonally, and it would often work out into something like a festival. You guys were at church today. We talked about seasons of festivities and stuff like that. And it was in a communion season, August 6th to 13th, that out of it they have a big outdoor festival. You'd eat afterwards, things like that. But you end up having this massive revival, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. Thing is Stone totally goes off the rails. Stone links up with these other folks, Alexander Campbell, Thomas Campbell, and they begin to reject some of the basic things about Presbyterianism. So they decide they're against infant baptism. You have to have an adult conversion experience. Only that will do. And they go, we don't want to have any creeds and confessions. We're going to go Bible alone. And this works out into a view that is now held by the Church of Christ. This is the origins of the Church of Christ, called Restorationism. It is the idea that right after the New Testament era, everything went to heck. And now, for roughly 1,800 years, the church was in relative darkness, and until their movement came around in the 19th century, Christianity was fundamentally and at its core flawed. Now, the Reformers never believed that. This is like the worst dumbing down of the Reformed concept of reformation. Why would you be reforming a church that was entirely depraved at that point? Concept was that there was always in the history of the church true belief, true Christians, and they really emphasized, these guys though, that you had to undergo a water baptism to be saved at the very core. And they had their means of explaining the thief on the cross. He got saved by Jesus saying, you'll be with me in paradise, because the New Testament hadn't fully been realized at that point, because Jesus was dying and not yet raised, so he doesn't count. But for the rest of us, you all have to be water baptized, probably dunked, or you can't be saved. This is the beginning of wild cult teaching in American history. The number of cults that have some sort of link to the Restorationist movement is wild. And this idea that the church fundamentally apostatized, fell off the face of the earth for roughly 1600 years until their group came along, lies at the heart of all these others. Latter-day Saints, you got Joseph Smith as its founder, but of course one of his right-hand men, Sidney Rigdon, was a Restorationist. And they teach that exact same thing now. When they come to your door, one of the number one things they're going to talk about is the restoration of the gospel. Gospel was lost completely until these guys came along. No one knew about it. And we are the true church. Adventism in the 1840s, you had this whole movement. It wasn't even a particular church or denomination that were fanatical about the idea that his imminent return was around the corner. They set dates. And in 1844 and 1843, the Adventists they totally expected Jesus to return, and they were subjected to incredible shame as a result of it. And the group doubled down through their teacher, which would be Ellen G. White, who solidified it. And to this day, Seventh-day Adventism comes from that group. Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1870s. Again, the whole doctrine of the Trinity was the invention of the church. Every Trinitarian church is wrong. We're the true thing. Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy. Really frightening religion. The idea that, all pain and suffering and evil is illusory and sin is to believe that it's real. And so you refuse medical treatment in any instance. And again, the idea is always that Christianity in its true form was lost and we found it again. The 19th century is the century of American cults, without a question. This is when the biggest cults to this day were all formed. All right. So in light of that, old school, new school, can you understand why certain Presbyterians would be a little bit frustrated with the sloppy job that some other Presbyterians are doing? You can understand immediately what these issues would be. The first one is confessional subscription. Old school Presbyterians want their ministers to agree that the Westminster Confession accurately summarizes biblical teaching. And they want you, before you go out into the ministry, to say you agree or you don't agree that this document contains the biblical system of doctrine. And if you disagree, because, for example, you want to have a Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper, go be Lutheran. If you disagree because you fundamentally believe in believer-only baptism, fine, just be a Baptist. But don't try to be a Presbyterian. And that was the key. The new school, their concept of confessional subscription was much more loose. We already saw that with Jonathan Edwards, there grew a distinction between whether or not a sinner is morally unable to receive the gospel or naturally unable. The idea being, is it just that they have a hardened heart and they really don't want to receive the gospel? Or is it that they have a fundamentally depraved being and they cannot receive the gospel? Do you see the difference between those two things? The new school is going to say that it's that they don't want to, and increasingly the new school, through some of Edwards' own disciples who part ways from him, are going to say, and if you can sufficiently deal with that lack of want, maybe even through more natural means, you can bring about a change of heart, birth from the freedom of the individual as opposed to a miraculous renewal in being birthed again. That's their concept. And so in the course of time, you have Calvinists who don't believe in total depravity, at least not as it's classically understood. So confessional subscription. Second thing is, old school is tired of interdenominational unions. They're saying this is part of the problem. How can we hold a minister of a Presbyterian church who's not Presbyterian to our doctrinal standards? How can this be done? Moreover, what is this society that we're planting churches from? Is that a church? Is that our Presbyterian church in America doing this? And the old school says they don't appreciate that. The new school says, and there's an optimism there. We should all work together. We're all Christians. We all believe in Jesus. Revivalism. Old school does not want anything to do with these new measures. New school, I should be clear. You'd have people who are a little more self-controlled to say, maybe I might not want to do that, but I don't want to kick that guy out of our denomination. Maybe the Spirit's really working through that. Maybe that's a good thing. And then there's a major one here too, is the mission of the church fundamentally to bring people to saving faith in Jesus Christ so that they're heaven-bound? Or is it to change society, the social norms, the laws, and the morality of society? Which one comes first? Increasingly, the new side is going to see the social mission of the church as at the forefront of her duties. Maybe right there and equally as important as the spiritual. The old school is going to say, we fundamentally exist. We advance the kingdom of God, not by making people Republicans, or not by making them any political persuasion, but by making them disciples of Jesus Christ, which is going to begin with a baptism, and it is going to mean reliance on the means of grace. That's what we fundamentally exist to do. And this is going to come up as well when we talk more about responses to slavery. So where this really comes to a head, and this is going to lead to the split of the church, is with a very capable minister by the name of Albert Barnes, who was on the new side. He's the new school guy. Albert Barnes, great preacher. And he has a sermon called The Way of Salvation, where he is engaging new school ideas. He is engaging a vision of the freedom of the will, which dumbs down the idea that salvation is a miracle, and dumbs down what would be classic Augustinianism, you might even say, about how salvation works. And people notice. He gets called to be the pastor of First Presbyterian in Philadelphia. And remember, there are 13 Presbyterian churches, at least in Philadelphia at this time. They're just the successive Presbyterian churches that get founded there. It's a Presbyterian hub. First Presbyterian is the first darn Presbyterian church in Philadelphia. Now, it's not to say that we don't apply scrutiny to all of the ministers, but this is kind of the crown jewel of Philadelphia Presbyterianism. Well, people get wind of this sermon right here, and they're not happy about it. The sermon gets denounced up and down in Presbytery. Formally denounced in speeches, you name it, and no one says who wrote it. There's just this sermon out there called The Way of Salvation, and it's terrible. Anyhow, this guy over here is getting ordained, Albert Barnes, or he's getting transferred. And there's this sort of, you might call it double-mindedness of the presbytery. They denounce his sermon upside down, but then they ordain him. Gets ordained. That's how things can work with voting. You ever feel like this is crazy? Like when you look at voting and you're like, in this state, somehow a Republican got elected as president, but the governor got elected as a Democrat. And you're like, who are the people who did the one and the other? Yeah? That's what this is like. How did that happen? Someone was right on the side? Well, in any case, there are others as well. A guy named George Duffield, Lyman Beecher. These guys are even more so than Barnes, compromising classic Presbyterian doctrine. And these are happening in presbyteries all over the country, but the one who's going to be made an example of, and he's going to be at the heart of things, is Barnes. What ends up happening is there are some very concerned ministers who write up the Western Memorial. The Western Memorial is a shout of alarm to the entire Presbyterian church saying, we got to do something. Our whole denomination is getting ripped out from under our feet. And it's followed, that one doesn't fare well in the General Assembly. That's the national gathering of the denomination, but they followed up with an even more tightly argued document called the Act and the Testimony of 1835, and the old school prevails in 1835. They get Barnes suspended, so he cannot preach for a year, so he's suspended. They also end a practice that they can't stand. See, the new school started to figure out that they didn't fit in certain presbyteries. So you'd have a church, maybe a church in Pennsylvania, and they knew that the greater part of their presbytery is old school, and they'd say, you know what, we're going to leave this presbytery, and we're going to be part of the New York Presbytery. And they go, but the boundaries of that presbytery doesn't go down into to Pennsylvania, and be like, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And you started to have these overlapping presbyteries covering the same regions. One's old school, one's new school. And these guys, they put the kibosh on that. You're a member of the presbytery that you're in that region of, and you don't get to elect to be in a different one. And then they shore it up so that you cannot transfer into another presbytery as a minister without being examined a second time. Maybe you got examined when you were first ordained. You're getting examined again when you come from this presbytery to that, to make sure we don't get infiltrated with these sorts of ideas we don't like. Well, here's the thing. The new school comes back with a vengeance in 1836. They get Barnes acquitted. And you see this going back and forth between these two warring parties in the Presbyterian Church? Well, here's what you have in 1837. This is an old school committee of correspondence that should say school. It says this: fathers, brethren, fellow Christians, whatever else may be dark, this is clear. We cannot continue in the same body. Apparently, there were originally caps on that. This got sent out everywhere. And you have the Great Divide. It's going to happen in 1837 that you have an exscinding act. The old school comes out in force. And this is one of the things that is frustrating. How many of you ever get frustrated thinking, well, if all Americans went to the polls, my guy would have won. They didn't show up. Anybody? You ever feel that way in an election? Yeah, there you go. For all of the virtues of democracy, all the virtues of republicanism, all the virtues of those things, it can really fail you if people don't get out. And you can have these instances where the body that is more ambitious, but maybe smaller, but willing to politic more, can get their people out. And you have oscillating general assemblies as a result. Well, by a vote of 143 to 110, you have an exscinding act. That is to say, 3 New York synods and 1 Ohio synod are just axed from the denomination. And the New York synods are particularly involved with the Congregationalists, as we saw at that Plan of Union started in New York. Finney is up there. And that meant 509 ministers, 28 presbyteries, and 60,000 communicants were exscinded overnight. And that is the beginning of the old school, new school divide, which is going to persist all the way through the Civil War. And when the Civil War comes on the scene, we're going to have another divide. So you have a fourfold Presbyterian church in America. And so we go to slavery. Any questions about this stuff, the old school, the new school? It means cut off. Yeah. So you're cut off from this denominational body. They didn't condemn them as hellbound, but they said we can't carry on when we really have this much of a fundamental difference between us. Anyone else? That's always bad and always ugly. Yeah. No, yeah. So because they exscinded whole synods, they're just out, and they formed their own thing. They actually, man, I can't believe I didn't put the 2 names up here. They had 2 names for themselves. You had 2 different Presbyterian churches, and they called themselves different, one's like the Constitutional, or I forget the 2 names. But yeah, they just formed another denomination. Now, what would happen, though, is you'd have individual congregations on the edge going, we're actually more new school. Some of the people in it say, no, we're more old school. You know what happened in those instances? That's more ugly, because certain churches are going to defect from the old school and become part of the new school. Others who are kind of on the edge in these particular synods would decide that they were actually more old school. So yeah, there'd be congregational disputes all over the place.
So the title for all the buildings and all the other property, though, I'm just thinking of what the PCA.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Some of the CRT churches maybe.
Yeah. There's no question. There were absolutely, these guys actually did, even in the old school, new school thing, get wrapped up in actual legal battles that would entail civil courts. I just didn't go into it that deep. But like, who owns the name Presbyterian Church, PCUS or whatever it was called at the time? It wasn't PCUS, but I forget the name. But those things came up. Yeah, Rich.
Of the groups that were extended, did any of that number, just sort of say to heck with Presbyterian polity as become Congregationalists?
Definitely. You have ministers in congregations that become congregational, and you're usually well on the road. Let me just put it this way. There is a very, very, very small congregational church in America now at all. It basically dissipated. Those who were maybe more conservative probably became Baptist, but once you went that direction, you weren't on a course for longevity at that point, because yeah, the liberalizing elements were very strong. I actually looked at a website recently with congregational churches. I was trying to do the installation service for Ben, and I was asking around. I was looking into the denomination. They have no standards. The only part about being congregational is that you have a congregational form of government, but there is no doctrinal statement that you have to adhere to. So I was just like, I couldn't even tell what it was. They were very proud of their history of being the descendants of Congregationalists. And I'm like, it's no wonder there's this small website of churches, because what are you? It was hard to say. But this takes us into the big E on the eye chart of the 19th century, which is slavery. And to tell this story, we've got to go back even to 1787 of the Synod of New York and Philadelphia. And this is obviously one of the big issues of the time. The question of abolition of slavery, as it pertains to the Presbyterian Church in particular, you could say it was a settled conclusion in the colonial period and after, until closer to the Civil War, that abolition needed to occur. We have got to get rid of this thing. The predominant view of Presbyterians was that it had to be done incrementally. So, for example, the transatlantic slave trade was actually abolished fairly quickly in American history, upon the birth of the nation after the Revolutionary War. By 1808, the transatlantic slave trade is illegal. This can't occur anymore. Now, it's not to say it didn't happen illegally. It did. But this definitely speaks to the ambition of the country to end this thing. You saw that Edwards, for example, owned a slave, owned a couple at different points. But he was very clear that man theft was a terrible, terrible crime. And they're going to agree on that throughout their history, you'll see. But I want to show you the 1787 Synod of New York and Philadelphia, what resides in their minutes, their statement. And I don't normally put bigger quotes up here because it's hard to read, but this time I felt it necessary to, and I highlight different parts. 1787. The Synod of New York and Philadelphia do highly approve of the general principles in favor of universal liberty that prevail in America, and the interest which many of the states have taken in promoting the abolition of slavery. First, they're going to commend the states that are already on this path. Many northern states abolished slavery very early on in the United States history. But he says, yet, inasmuch as men introduced from a servile state to a participation of all the privileges of civil society without a proper education and without previous habits of industry may be, in many respects, dangerous to the community. Therefore, they earnestly recommend it to all the members belonging to their communion to give those persons who are at present held in servitude such good education as may prepare them for the better enjoyment of freedom. And they, moreover, recommend that masters, wherever they find servants disposed to make a proper improvement of the privilege, would give them some share of property to begin with, or grant them sufficient time and sufficient means procuring by industry their own liberty at a moderate rate, that they may thereby be brought into society and with those habits of industry that may render them useful citizens. They wanted to have slaves, African slaves in our country, properly educated, properly put in a place where they can actually be contributing members of society, even commending giving them some share of property with which to work. These are biblical principles. This is what was supposed to happen with those who were enslaved in Hebrew society. It was, as we're going to see, it really was intended to be more like an apprenticeship or something, preparing, one's countrymen to be, again, contributing members of a society. And they know. And finally, they recommend it to all the people under their care to use the most prudent measures, confident with the interest and the state of civil society in the parts where they live, to procure eventually the final abolition of slavery in America. This is the formal 1787 statement of the American body of Presbyterians. Now, things will get complicated, but this represents what is called an incrementalist view of abolition. Now, let's note what's missing. How long should it take for every single slave in America to be manumitted and for the total abolition of slavery in America to occur? How long should that be? It doesn't say. Is there any point at which we go, no longer? See, that's going to be one of the challenging things when it comes to dealing with the matter of slavery, in the course of the 19th century. And here's what we're going to look at. So what happens is you've got a man by the name of George Bourne. Bourne is a minister in Virginia. And in fact, he was a tremendous influence on William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, he is the editor of The Liberator, probably one of the most confrontational abolitionist magazines of the time. This is not pulling any punches. There were several abolitionist publications, but this one in particular is going for the jugular. Garrison said he learned everything he knew from Bourne. All of his basic principles came from Bourne, reverend in the Presbyterian church. Now, Bourne is going to have a piece of writing, and I'll show you it in a moment, which is hardcore abolitionist. It actually has some very good arguments. I would actually argue the very best statement of the biblical case against American slavery is articulated by Theodore Weld, who was a Congregationalist or came from Congregationalist origins. He wasn't a minister, but tremendous work, and I'll reference that in passing, but it's called The Bible Against Slavery. But Bourne precedes him in his publication. Now let me show you what Bourne argued. His book was called The Book and Slavery Irreconcilable. His case against slavery goes like this. Spanning the Old and New Testament, man theft, the theft of people, kidnapping, is a capital crime. God is against stealing people and selling people. He's against it. He's against it in the Mosaic Law. It's referenced in passing in 1 Timothy in some of the terrible crimes that people can engage in. And fundamentally, the American slavery system was built on one of man theft. Whether the man theft took place by the various African tribes who took captive other people or sold their brethren into slavery doesn't matter. This whole institution is built on a crime. That's his argument. The second argument is that slaves actually, and he has a ton of arguments, but it's saturated with rhetoric that's really over the top. Second thing is that slaves were supposed to have a wage. The whole idea is that in the course of time in being a slave in a Hebrew society, you'd do that for some 6 years, and by the end of it, you'd have enough not only to either purchase your freedom or to pay off a debt, but enough money to go out and to be productive and to manage yourself. And he based that on all of these scriptures as well. The other thing is the law in Deuteronomy 23:15, which is reasserted in a variety of ways in other places, that if you happen to find a slave who's a fugitive and they come to your home, you are not to return them to their master. You guys know Deuteronomy 23:15 says that? This was actually a major point of debate, and I'll just read the actual passage as to whether or not this was applicable to American slavery. But obviously, the Jews, having been a people who were once enslaved, in general, their nation was to be a place where slaves could find shelter. So Deuteronomy 23:15, you shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. What does this mean when it comes to the American Fugitive Slave Act, which says, in fact, the opposite, that you have to return a slave to their master? It means conscientious objecting Christians, especially those who are abolitionists, are going to say, heck no. Yeah, they're going to say that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How would they respond to when Paul talks of the escaped slave and said, I'll send them back to you?
Yeah, so the instance with Philemon and whether or not he has to be sent back to Onesimus, Paul seems to reason with Onesimus, appealing to his Christian graces to let him continue to help Paul. That's Philemon, whom he met when he had escaped. He doesn't just go straight to Deuteronomy 23:15. I imagine the argument would be along the lines that Paul, recognizing that Roman law would demand that this fugitive slave go back, he's trying to more gently reason with Philemon, saying, as a Christian, you ought not to do this, rather than to maybe push him. And this is actually a very thoughtful thing that Paul would be doing, because Dabney is going to admit that one of the reasons the South cleaves to their slaves as they do is because of how intensely various northern abolitionists are prodding them, goading them, and even shaming them. And so that would be the argument. that Paul is intentionally trying to avoid this Roman citizen asserting his rights according to civil law. Here's a big thing. American slaves were by and large not generally allowed to marry. When they did marry, that did not stop the sale of husband and wife to different owners by one master, and it did not stop them from selling the children of such a family to others as well. This was seen as abhorrent, and to be honest with you, I have no doubt that the South itself is somewhat shamed by this. It's something you don't want mentioned. You're tearing families apart. And they point out that in Colossians 4 and Ephesians 6, one thing that Paul does say to masters is to not be overbearing. It's difficult to imagine something more overbearing than taking your children and selling them to Lord knows where to never see them again. And then finally, one of the biggest arguments is that the institution of slavery was fundamentally voluntary, something that people in the Old Testament, in God's law about slavery, you would enter into out of economic conditions. And the only time it was involuntary was if you had committed a crime and you fundamentally needed to repay some debt or recompense for that crime. But they'd say that's the only way to explain why when a slave has escaped, they're saying, I entered into this economic relationship, it turned out to be dangerous, and I'm leaving, and that's why you're supposed to shield the slave from the master. If at the end of the day they're not doing the work of helping to introduce you into society, then you're not bound by that institution anymore, so the argument goes. Yes, Cameron? I thought I saw a hand back there.
It's really interesting. I've never heard it before that pointing to the slavery passage in Scripture are themselves an argument against slavery. I've never heard that before.
Well, and I'll say this, as I had mentioned earlier, Weld's book on the topic it's masterful. And he articulates this much better than Bourne does. But let me show you why this is a problem. These are good arguments, but here's why this book is a problem. And this is why I think the Presbyterians were right, as you will see, to depose him. Somebody read this quote. Burlesque.
Upon everything sacred for a man to tend to Christianity, far more dishonorable and injurious to the church, to permit him to preach and rule in the spiritual affairs of morals.
Okay, here's what he says. If you own a slave at all, I don't care who you are, you own a slave? Are you educating them, taking them to church, maybe even taking them to church and refusing to segregate? Maybe you're doing all that. Guess what? You're as bad as a man stealer. You're as bad as a human trafficker. It doesn't matter who you are. You're as bad as the people in the Congo going out and, if you could imagine, lassoing slaves onto a boat and, subjecting them to the worst of evils. All of you. And frankly, you're not a Christian. Frankly, what does that mean? You shouldn't be communed. You absolutely can't be a preacher. This is actually the lightest bit of rhetoric throughout it. By far. It is a diatribe against anyone who has anything to do with slavery whatsoever. And essentially he's going to say the entire church that owns a slave in any manner or capacity ought to be excommunicated. That is the implication of this writing. Well, here's the thing. All of that's not true. If you have a person who has been sold into slavery and now you have the capacity to be a Christian master who in turn is going to educate them, who does want to keep their family together, who does want to see them imbibe the Christian religion and has an intention to manumit in the course of time, you are not the same as a person who's stolen another human being. You just can't say that. And that's the situation. And this is a real point of wisdom for people today. How many people know abortion abolitionists who go and picket churches who are not sufficiently and outspokenly pro-life? Anybody know folks like that? I know folks like that. They hate any church that isn't out on the lines with them every weekend protesting as they would. There is sometimes a dangerous sort of spirit that's even for a good cause, which will condemn anyone and everyone who's not as active as they are in the particular matters that they are. So here's the thing, though. In 1818, the General Assembly, they're going to oppose Bourne. deposed Bourne. He's going to lose his ministry there. And Green, Ashbel Green, president of Princeton, is going to write at the same presbytery or General Assembly the most overt denunciation of slavery that you will ever find in the history of the Presbyterian Church. And it passes unanimously. That means every single Southern Presbyterian delegate to the General Assembly, they pass this statement. And I'm going to read this to you so that you can get a sense of where the Presbyterian Church fell on the matter. We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, as utterly inconsistent with the law of God, which requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and as totally irreconcilable with the spirit and the principles of the gospel of Christ, which enjoin that all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even also unto them. Slavery creates a paradox in the moral system. It exhibits rational, accountable, and immortal beings in such circumstances as scarcely to leave them the power of moral action. It is manifestly the duty of all Christians who enjoy the light of the present day to use their honest, earnest, and unwearied endeavors to correct the errors of former times and as speedily as possible to efface this blot on our holy religion and to obtain complete abolition of slavery throughout Christendom and, if possible, it should say throughout the world. They're very clear they want this thing to end. But they're not going to say every single Christian at this point who is in the process perhaps of realizing this end it has to be excommunicated from the church.
Or just go to hell.
Yeah, exactly. That's which is what the more hardcore abolitionists are going to say. Well, here's what happens. In antebellum South, that's pre-1830. I'm just talking pre-1830 now. It's estimated that in Virginia there were over 100,000 manumissions that took place in Virginia. That is to say, slaves who had total freedom. They had been, they're no longer in that position of a slave to a master. Okay, so that's pre-1830. It's very, very clear. Even a defender of the South in the Civil War, J.H. Thornwell, one of his famous sermons, The Rights and Duties of Masters, he preaches this sermon in 1850 after they had just built a new church and schoolhouse for the slave populations of his region in South Carolina. And talks about the importance of educating slaves. And yes, at this point, it is still a segregated situation. They have their own church, but at the end of the day, the sermon is devoted to the need to educate and the need to build up that community. You have, not only that, but you have Presbyterian ordained black preachers. John Francis Cook over here is the founder and pastor of the 15th Street Colored Presbyterian in D.C. John Chavis was a famous to the African-American evangelist, and he preached in North Carolina, in Maryland, in Virginia. That there's a plaque that commemorates him, African-American teacher, preacher. He actually fought in the Revolutionary War, and he studied under John Witherspoon, the most famous president of Princeton, who was a signer of the Constitution. And it says he taught free, black, and prominent white students in school nearby. But you had the ministry actually being taken up by various people in the black community in the South. You would say this, if there were any two states that were the most hardened in their position in cleaving to slavery, it would be South Carolina and Georgia. Almost all of the other states had made significant advances in the direction of seeing to it that slaves were indeed manumitted, seeing to it that they were indeed educated and integrated the more. But here's the thing. Antebellum South, after the 1830s, sees a radical shift. There were several instances like that of Nat Turner, who was himself a minister, led a slave rebellion that resulted in the massacre of about 70 white people, mostly women and children. These sorts of things. Now, it doesn't matter that that's a relatively small amount of the population. It just takes one event like that to really enrage people. And without a question, there were plenty of people who had deeply racist views of the black population, and they were ready to have a more hardened view of slavery. Not only that, they're fugitive slaves. You had people who maybe did purchase a slave at, in some point in the past, or their business was reliant upon slave labor. And when you have all of your slave labor, fugitives leaving, just imagine right now, if you lost your car or some asset that you were reliant on, you can imagine that would really harden you, wouldn't it? And then there was intense abolitionist rhetoric that was profoundly shaming to people in the South. Some of it perhaps in order, but others, well, as we saw with Bourne, I mean, you're not a Christian. You should just be, excommunicated completely. You're out. And as that increased, I want to show you what Robert Dabney, who's going to be one of the main defenders of the South, I want you to see what he has to say about this. Their unauthorized attempts to strike off the fetters of our slaves have but riveted them on faster. Does this fact arise from perversity of our nature? I believe that it does in part. We're less inclined to that which we know to be our duty because persons who have no right to interfere demand it from us. Now that is a remarkable statement. I think it's probably one of the most honest statements that a Southern defender of slavery in its capacity could ever make. I think it's more honest than often many of us are when it comes to matters that we feel like someone's trying to take something that's ours. Dabney was clear on that point. Dabney actually made the prediction in 1840 that if it had not been for the radical abolitionists, Virginia would have abolished slavery within the decade. That's what he argues. He thinks that it would have happened. But due to those more radical efforts, that's one of the main reasons people cleave to the institution the more. Dabney's most famous defense of slavery is his book, In Defense of Virginia. The sorts of arguments that he'll erect for slavery, even for much longer term than anyone around him had expected, and with this change of heart, could have been indefinitely long. As he goes, slavery was divinely established. Where did it come from? Genesis 9 tells us that Canaan is cursed on account of his father's sin. That's where slavery came from. God instituted it, or he at least established it. How can it be sinful? He'll argue in turn that although Israel did require the freeing of any Hebrew slave, Leviticus 25, which I'll preach on eventually, tells us that you could have a lifelong foreign slave. So there is precedent for what we're doing, he says. He goes, moreover, if slavery was not the sort of thing that we'd find again and again in society, why would it actually make its appearance in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which if anything's enduring in the Old Testament, it's those. And on the Sabbath, what are you supposed to do? Give rest to your manservant and your maidservant. And what are you not to do according to the 10th commandment? Covet your neighbor's wife, his house, his servant. Why would this enduring moral code have this here unless it was to be something we'd see again and again? And he'll point out in the New Testament where Roman slavery was practiced and the conditions at least as harsh, maybe more harsh than anything we've seen in the South in terms of how few rights a slave had. Paul doesn't argue for its total abolition. He argues that there's a Christian way to do this. Now, I'll tell you, I think these arguments, frankly, fall flat for a variety of reasons. Pointing out the situation with Roman slavery with the totally pagan empire that Paul had no power to change. He's advising people how to live when this is a social reality. But you're in America where everybody claims to be Christian. So why is that relevant? Moreover, when it comes to lifelong foreign slaves, in the case of Israel, that doesn't apply, notably, to proselytes, those who actually embrace the religion of Israel. In that instance, they would presumably fall into the same situation as any of your countrymen. And notably, these slaves are by and large Christian. So why would this come to bear, in this particular instance? And, I think his arguments that slavery as an institution is not inherently sinful if practiced with these sorts of, wise guidelines given to us by God, that's something that's noteworthy. And frankly, for all human time, even if we don't have slaves, we're going to have people with jobs that are a lot more slave-like than other people. And that's why it meaningfully appears in the Decalogue. Those who have, hard labor jobs which are less forgiving. still yet should get rest. And arguably where they appear in the Decalogue is in commandments asking you to let these people rest. One of the great ironies is you will find treatises written by Southern Presbyterians defending the perpetuity of the fourth commandment as the Sabbath, and yet holding slaves in a condition with very little rest. Well, what ends up happening is you get a fourfold division of the Presbyterian Church. In 1861, the Old School Assembly, this is right after the bombing of Fort Sumter, the Old School Assembly meets, and it's just weeks after the war has begun. Now, the Old School generally doesn't want to get too involved in these matters of politics, but there are telegraphs with Lincoln's cabinet between members of the General Assembly discussing what the church should say as a whole, and they come out with this statement. This is the Old School Church. Let ministers and churches do all in their power to promote and perpetuate the integrity of these United States and to strengthen, uphold, and encourage the federal government. Can any Southern Presbyterians agree with this statement? No. And that splits the Old School Church into North and South. And the New School Church is going to get split into North and South. And now you have your fourfold Presbyterian Church in America. New School South, New School North, Old School South. Charles Hodge, Old School North. Thornwell, Dabney, Old School South. Well, what happens in the course of the war is that the South gets united much more quickly than does the North. All that New School, Old School stuff, that kind of goes out the window. Thornwell is still cleaving to it, and he opposes the union of the Southern churches. Dabney is all for it, and arguably Dabney was more for a united South than he was for taking the strict standards of the Old School to make sure you have doctrinal integrity. He wanted the South to win the war, and I think he did believe that a united church would have been very important to that. Various churches in Kentucky Old School, and Missouri Old School churches right on the border, they just joined the Southern Church, which will become the PCUS, in contrast to what will be the Northern Church, which is the PCUSA. They're just United States, these guys. The other ones are United States of America, because there's one federal government that encompasses them all. Northern Church does not unite as one until 1869, after the war, and Hodge stands out opposing it. And I am pretty sure that when I was talking about the Old and New School, and if you don't mind me just skipping back, I did skip just to even know who these guys are, but Hodge and, there you go, yeah. Your guys, Hodge and Thornwell, just powerhouses to this day. Hodge is probably the most famous American systematic theologian. He wrote on everything from Darwinism to systematic theology, tons of things on church polity. Just an amazing man. He opposed the union because he was so old school. He didn't want to see the dumbing down of Presbyterian theology, even though the rest of the country just wanted healing. Well, that takes us to after the war, and we'll wrap up here, you guys. Just a few slides. Anyone have any questions for me about slavery in America, Presbyterianism, anything like that? Yeah.
Well, in the Old Testament, God used slavery as punishment upon Israel, with the Syrian invasion, the Babylonian invasion.
Yeah.
And slavery was a divine punishment.
Yeah.
God used as well as just, the sword.
Yeah.
And famine.
Yeah, national servitude is what you're talking about, which was a big thing as well.
They were sent away. In fact, they didn't even know where the 10 tribes are.
Yes.
And the other one that went to Babylon, some of them came back.
Yeah. Well, no, that's true. And you could argue that perhaps what's going on is, some sort of national judgment on these tribes. But here's the thing. Even when God nationally judges Israel by, for example, servitude to Assyria, God in Isaiah 10 says, I'm going to send you into Assyria, and they're going to rule you. And then he says, when I'm done with that, then I'm going to judge the Assyrians for being so proud and haughty for doing it. So here's the thing. Just because God providentially uses international affairs to judge peoples does not absolve the peoples involved in doing it from their guilt in so treating their fellow man. And that's a pretty standard principle throughout the scriptures, in all but the instances, particularly with the tribes of Canaan, where there's a fairly no-holds-barred policy with those people, and they seem to be representations of reprobation and eternal judgment. but only God could tell us that something like that was going on or that we're justified in treating people that way. But that said, Western evangelism can persist after the war. This guy, Sheldon Jackson, a famous Presbyterian minister, I think associated with the PCUS, was involved in the creation of some 100 churches in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, Idaho, Montana, and he ends up in Alaska. And in fact, you're looking at a picture of like one of the earliest communities in Sitka, Alaska, behind you there. And he actually got to be the moderator of the General Assembly in 1897. He was, famed for his efforts in the West. And there's a story of him looking out over, across the Missouri River and going, it's my life mission to evangelize this West. And that's what he spent his time doing. So that persists. But there's an incredible optimism that follows the war, and particularly an optimism that was common to the New School, that we can bring about incredible social change. Guess what? They kind of won at the end of the Civil War, right? And it's hard to say who won when you lose tens of thousands of Americans on both sides and have casualties across the board, but the fact is, slavery got abolished. And there is this vigor in the late 19th century to make the world moral. And this is where you see the social gospel arising. And not only that, interchurch alliances. Protestants increasingly in this end of the century have a lot of interchurch alliances. They actually have these formal organizations where we're the alliance of whatever. And usually they're always anti-Roman Catholic, strong anti-Roman Catholic sentiment. Part of that's because in Vatican I, in the Syllabus of Errors, it condemns things like democracy, which Americans were all about. Why do you think they did that? Well, on the continent of Europe, what is the horrible and horrific expression of democracy that the Roman Catholic Church would be particularly bothered by? Any guesses in the 19th century? They had the French Revolution. They weren't pleased with that. Blood filling the streets of a highly Roman Catholic country. And the Syllabus of Errors in Vatican I condemns all of that. It's also the same church council in Rome where it asserts papal infallibility. And of course, Protestants didn't like that. So the Protestants start to consolidate against the Catholics and against social causes. Blue laws. They want to see the state uphold Sunday Sabbath laws that you're not to work in the same capacity that you otherwise would. Increasingly, prohibition. This is actually a huge thing. In fact, one Southern Presbyterian pastor who I didn't quote says basically slavery is the greatest evil in this country. It's like a Mississippi Presbyterian. The greatest evil in this country with the exception of alcohol. That's the greatest evil. And prohibition is going to begin to rise at the end of efforts toward it at the end of the 19th century. And just emphasis on family values and things like that start to define what it means to be American Christian. Here's an old cartoon, decrying the evils of drink. Step 1, a glass with friends. Step 2, a glass to keep the cold out. And it was obviously alcohol was a medicine. We use a glass too much. Is this guy, I don't know, has to pee his pants. Drunk and riotous. And then eventually, the summit attained jolly companions and a social drunkard or something like that. But then the other side of this is down to like suicide is where you're going to end up. This is an interesting chart. I will have to express my concern that Jesus might appear on it somewhere, which is one of the big problems with being overly ambitious with your morality. Jesus surely did drink wine, and he was never a drunk, but apparently he did have a glass with friends and didn't ever end up over here as, someone dissipating with his pals. But you have to understand this idea that we can make everybody good according to some standard of morality, that we can end personal vice. These things are still at the forefront of politics today in the left. We're all going to learn a new language and learn 35 new genders. People, can't even graduate high school, some people, but we're going to master that and we're going to be epic citizens, right? I mean, these are the sorts of things that still prevail today. And prohibition was the beginning of it. It's weird, but people don't think of it as a progressive cause. It was like extremely progressive cause. To have this thing that's been around for all of human history and to just make it disappear. But the last thing I'll just mention is that the 19th century began to see incredible intellectual challenges to the faith, perhaps like it never had before. Higher critical views of the Bible. This is really weird. No one ever couches it this way, but there was a philosopher who viewed all of reality as developing from something simple to more complex. His name was Hegel. And every single field found development everywhere. In higher critical views of the Bible, the idea was it began as something, maybe just barely monotheistic, maybe henotheistic. There are many gods, but there's kind of one God for us. And it morphed into something this beautiful monotheism. And it began with very, primitive documents and became more complex and beautiful and all put together. And that was the view of the Bible. And so, you had David Strauss with his critical views of the Gospels and what was original and what really spoke to who the historical Jesus was behind it all. Because what we have is this finished product of development and growth. Likewise, you have in that same era, the Darwin's theory of evolution, that species just the same. You begin with something very primitive and you end up with something, complex. And so Charles Hodge, who we've mentioned before, old school stalwart, he has his book, What is Darwinism? And this is written in an age in the 19th century where you still didn't have to be a total specialist to talk about things. No one right now would want to know what any given Christian minister's thoughts on Darwinism were. You don't have a microbiology degree, much less a PhD. But back then, these guys could kind of talk about everything, and they did. And this was thought to be a pretty interesting interaction with the theory. In fact, the Princeton theologians and Presbyterians in general were thought to be more adept to developing a Christianity that could really work with scientific development, that they could incorporate that into the system. And you will have guys who say, okay, maybe something like Darwin's theory happens on some level, but it's guided by God, things like that. But more or less, Hodge is pretty opposed to it. And we'll see later Princeton theologians warming up to it as a possible means of the development of the species. But we'll talk about that next time at our last historical roots for the PCA class. Does anyone have any questions for me to conclude? All right, well, wild century, huh? And it's kind of hard to get all of that into one lecture. We did the best we could. But we'll end there. And guys, have a blessed Lord's Day. Get some rest. And by the way, we would normally have our last meeting on the 9th. But what is the 9th? It's Mother's Day. I think it's the 9th. Yeah, that's right. It's the 9th. So we're not going to have our meeting that day. So we're not going to have our last meeting till the end of May, the 4th week in May, which is great. Give me a little break. Give moms a break. And hope to see you all there. So blessings. Have a good one. Good stuff, huh? Yeah.
Again, because I honestly, like the Civil War stuff, most of it for me, as I understood it, was so much of economics.
Oh, yeah.
Economics.
Oh, yeah.
And so it introduces a whole other thing.
Will do. Bye, guys. Yeah.
I didn't realize that split.
Yeah.
That four-way split.
Oh, yeah.
And how, that had to be so just crazily disruptive.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.